Welcome back to Random History. I'm your navigator as we explore the little-known events and people that make history such an amazing subject. The events I delve into are probably not ones you learned about in school. These are the ones that when you do hear about them, you're likely to think they could not possibly be real. But they are. When I was in high school, one of the best classes I took was an elective history class called Ohio History. One of our required readings was a book by Allan W Eckert called The Frontiersman, because it centered around the founding of Ohio as first a territory and then a state. The book was one of a series called The Winning of America. One of the other books in the series was titled The Conquerors, and it focused on Pontiac's War in the 1760s. The series of books really is what sparked my interest, and some might say obsession, with history. Eckert passed away in 2011 at the age of 80, but his books live on as they continue to inspire and inform generations about the early days when the Ohio River Valley was the American frontier. Pontiac was an Ottawa chief that formed a huge alliance with other nations to resist the British takeover of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains following the French and Indian War. That's the 7 Years' War in Europe. Their coordinated attacks on almost every single British stronghold in the West took the empire totally by surprise. Today's episode will retell one of those attacks. Native Americans saw Pontiac, and later Tecumseh of the Shawnee Nation, as resistance fighters. Our true hero for this episode was also a resistance fighter. He fought for the Polish underground during World War II, helping shine light on the atrocities at Auschwitz, and also fight the Nazis during the Warsaw Uprising. Unfortunately, he would ultimately be executed by the Soviets after their occupation of Poland. And now, without further delay, and for my Ohio history teacher, Mr. Grierson, the story of the Battle of Fort Michilimackinac and Witold Pilecki on today's episode of Random History. The capture of Fort Michilimackinac during Pontiac's War, which ranged from 1763 to 1766, serves as one of the most striking examples of indigenous resistance against British colonial power in North America. This event not only showcases the strategic acumen of the Native American forces, but also underscores the use of indigenous cultural events, such as lacrosse, to aid in military deception. Today's episode will examine the context of Pontiac's War, the strategic capture of Fort Michilimackinac, and how a seemingly innocent lacrosse game became instrumental in this landmark victory. Pontiac's War emerged in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, as the British tightened their hold on territories previously controlled by the French in North America. Although Britain emerged victorious in 1763, Native American tribes across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions found themselves in increasingly hostile circumstances. The British instituted policies that curbed essential supplies like gunpowder and firearms, both necessary for hunting and defense. Additionally, British commanders such as Geoffrey Amherst disallowed traditional diplomatic practices, including gift-giving, which had been an essential part of the French-indigenous relations. Frustrations with British policies quickly grew, creating resentment among the indigenous nations who found these policies to be disrespectful and dismissive of their sovereignty. Pontiac, an Ottawa leader, sought to unite the tribes against the British, aiming to reclaim autonomy over their lands. While his coalition was not universally supported, he found enthusiastic allies among the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Huron, or the Wyandot, tribes. These nations coordinated attacks on British outposts, striking multiple forts and settlements throughout the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley region. Their strategy of capturing British forts represented a concerted attempt by native nations to weaken British control and send a clear message about their resistance to colonial encroachment. Fort Michilimackinac was one of the key British forts located in present-day Michigan. The fort's location at the juncture of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron made it a critical site for trade and communication between British and indigenous communities. As one of the westernmost British outposts, it was also somewhat isolated, which made it more vulnerable to surprise attacks. This vulnerability was evident to the Ojibwe and allied Potawatomi forces, who laid plans to capture the fort in 1763. The British garrison at Fort Michilimackinac did not expect an attack from the indigenous forces. The soldiers considered the tribes in the area to be friendly, or at least non-hostile. The indigenous fighters capitalized on this perception and devised a clever plan using the traditional game of bagatelle, which would later become known as lacrosse. On 2 June 1763, the Ojibwa and Potawatomi staged a lacrosse game outside the fort. The game was ostensibly a celebration of King George III's birthday, an occasion that put the British guards at ease. Lacrosse was a sport with deep cultural significance for many indigenous nations. Typically, they involved large teams and was an energetic and often chaotic game. The British soldiers, having seen similar games played on prior occasions, allowed the game to take place within sight of the fort, unaware that it would be used as a distraction for an attack. During the game, players accidentally threw the ball over the fort's walls. As part of the ruse, several indigenous players entered the fort to retrieve it, while others gathered near the gates. Unbeknownst to the British guards, the Ojibwa players had smuggled weapons into the fort or had stashed them nearby. As more players and bystanders moved close to the entrance, they signaled each other to begin the assault. The Ojibwa and Potawatomi attackers quickly overpowered the unsuspecting British, taking control of the fort with minimal resistance. The lacrosse game's successful use as a ruse not only underscores the indigenous warriors' adaptability and knowledge of British complacency, but also highlights how indigenous culture was adeptly woven into strategic military tactics. By using a well-known cultural tradition, the indigenous forces could mask their intentions until the last possible moment, ensuring an element of surprise that proved decisive. The capture of Fort Michilimackinac sent a powerful message to both British and indigenous communities. For the British, the event was a stark reminder of the hostility they faced from indigenous nations and the risks of underestimating their military prowess. In response, British forces were forced to reevaluate their fortifications and policies in the Great Lakes region, especially in terms of treating indigenous tribes with greater respect and caution. For the indigenous allies, the victory at Michilimackinac was a morale booster and demonstrated the potential of coordinated resistance. The success of the attack proved to other tribes that British forts were not impregnable. The capture of Michilimackinac exemplified the effectiveness of combining traditional cultural practices with cunning and strategic planning. Despite the eventual suppression of Pontiac's war, the event continued to resonate, illustrating the indigenous people's commitment to defending their lands and sovereignty. The use of lacrosse in the capture of Fort Michilimackinac is a unique example of indigenous innovation in warfare. Lacrosse held spiritual and social significance for many Native American tribes. It was not merely a game, but also a way of honoring cultural heritage and strengthening community bonds. Its use as a decoy reflects the indigenous warriors' ability to creatively adapt aspects of their culture to serve new purposes under difficult conditions. The story of Fort Michilimackinac also highlights the wider impact of cultural misunderstandings between the British and indigenous peoples. While the British had witnessed lacrosse games before, they failed to recognize its significance and the potential for its use in warfare. This oversight reflects a broader cultural chasm that existed between the British colonial forces and the indigenous nations, a gap that would continue to have implications throughout the colonial period and beyond. The capture of Fort Michilimackinac during Pontiac's War stands as a testament to the indigenous nations' resistance against colonial oppression and their innovative use of cultural practices in warfare. The cunning plan executed through the lacrosse game exemplifies how indigenous warriors could leverage cultural knowledge to outsmart their enemies. Although the fort's capture did not lead to the collapse of British power, it was a critical victory for Pontiac's coalition, illustrating that indigenous nations possessed not only the will, but also the strategic insight to challenge European forces. The events at Michilimackinac serve as a reminder of the complexities and resilience of indigenous resistance and the role of cultural elements in shaping historical events. Resistant efforts like Pontiac's have been in nearly every war throughout history. Working in secret, these resistance movements are known for their improvisation and flexibility. One of the most extensive resistance efforts was in World War II against the Nazis. Nearly every occupied nation had an organization that fought the tyranny of Hitler and the Nazi Party. Today's true hero is one of those resistance fighters, a man who risked his life to end the oppression of the Third Reich. only to see one despot replaced by another. The latter would ultimately see him executed. Witold Pilecki, a Polish army officer and member of the resistance during World War II, is remembered as one of the most courageous figures of the era for his efforts to expose the atrocities of Auschwitz and resist Nazi forces. Pilecki's heroic life included voluntarily entering Auschwitz, enduring the hardships within, and building an underground resistance network. His actions and his ultimate sacrifice reflect not only his bravery, but also his commitment to truth and justice. Born in 1901, Pilecki grew up in an era when Poland was partitioned among neighboring empires. His patriotic devotion started early, joining the Polish military in 1918 to fight in the Polish-Soviet War. By 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, Pilecki was a lieutenant in the Polish army. Following Poland's defeat, he joined the secret Polish army, a resistance group dedicated to fighting the occupation. Pilecki's most renowned act of resistance came in 1940, when he volunteered to infiltrate the newly established Auschwitz concentration camp to gather intelligence on Nazi activities, especially the rumored mass killings, and organize an underground network within the camp. To carry out his mission, Pilecki arranged to be captured during a Warsaw street roundup and was transported to Auschwitz. Inside, he witnessed appalling brutality, starvation, and mass executions. Pilecki was horrified by the mass suffering, but also determined to record and report what he saw. Despite the unimaginable conditions, he began organizing a covert network called the Union of Military Organization with other inmates. This network helped distribute extra food, clothing, and support, as well as gather intelligence on Nazi activities and plans. One of the first significant achievements of Pilecki's network was their effort to build a radio transmitter. In 1942, he and fellow inmates managed to construct a makeshift radio from smuggled parts, a remarkable feat considering the constant surveillance and limited resources in the camp. The radio was used to send reports to the Polish resistance, providing critical information about the atrocities occurring at Auschwitz and detailing the systematic extermination of Jews and other groups. These transmissions were among the first verified accounts of the genocide taking place, though the outside world was very slow to respond. Pilecki's reports revealed that Auschwitz was a death camp, not merely a detention center as some had initially believed. He documented the establishment of gas chambers and crematoria, detailing the industrial-scale killing within Auschwitz. Pilecki's information was so detailed and explicit that it reached the Polish government in exile in London, which passed it on to Allied forces. Despite mounting evidence, however, many in the West were initially reluctant to believe the extent of the atrocities, delaying a meaningful response. In 1943, as conditions worsened and the Gestapo intensified its crackdown on resistance activities, Pilecki realized that his presence in Auschwitz was becoming increasingly perilous. Concerned that he might not survive much longer, he planned and executed a daring escape. Pilecki, along with 2 fellow prisoners, overpowered a guard and fled the camp, eventually reaching Warsaw. Once free, Pilecki reported to the Polish resistance and continued his anti-Nazi activities, even taking part in the Warsaw Uprising. Encouraged by the proximity of the Soviet army, the Polish resistance fighters led an uprising in Warsaw, under the impression that the Soviets would join forces to help drive the Nazis out. They didn't. Instead, the Soviet army left the resistance to face the Nazis alone. That way, the Soviets thought, the Germans would likely eliminate the leaders of the movement, thus making it much easier for the Soviets to take control of Poland when the war was over. That way, there would be many fewer leaders to resist communist control. Pilecki survived the uprising, and his first-hand accounts of Auschwitz were published by the Polish underground and disseminated to the Allies. Unfortunately, like I said before, these reports faced skepticism from some Allied leaders. After the war, Pilecki's suffering did not end. Poland, under Soviet control, viewed Pilecki with suspicion due to his opposition to totalitarian regimes and affiliation with Western allies. The communist government arrested him in 1947, subjected him to torture and a sham trial that led to his execution in 1948. Only decades later, after the fall of communism, was Pilecki's story fully acknowledged and honored in Poland and beyond. Witold Pilecki's legacy is that of an unwavering commitment to humanity, truth, and resistance against oppression. His time in Auschwitz, where he organized a resistance network, built a clandestine radio, and documented the atrocities, highlights the extraordinary lengths he went to in order to fight against injustice. Today, Pilecki is celebrated as a Polish hero and a symbol of resistance to tyranny, whose courage serves as an enduring inspiration. Pilecki, and really all the people I highlight in the True Heroes segment, did not set out to be heroes. Yet, when they felt that duty called, they answered. These people definitely deserve our respect and admiration. See, they did not seek recognition, but they stepped up when others couldn't or wouldn't. They aren't famous for playing a sport or prancing around on a stage. They were often unknown, but their lives forever changed the world. This brings us to the end of another episode of Random History. I hope you enjoyed it and will come back and listen to future episodes. If you'd like to view the transcript or sources for the episode, click the link in the description. You can also make suggestions for future topics by clicking that same link or just shooting us an email. As always, I want to thank Argos Media for producing Random History and to thank my wonderful wife for her continued support and inspiration. Until next time, make some history of your own. Navigator out.